Hello, everyone. This is my methodological critique presentation, but I want to start with a couple apologies. My equipment isn't great, so if the sound or video is crappy, I'm sorry. The other is that being quarantined, my whole family is home and upstairs, so if there's like wailing or thumping, I'm just gonna kind of soldier on. So I apologize if that happens. And then also, I am sick, so I might sniffle a little bit. So I did my methodological critique on Victor Cicansky, who is a Regina-born ceramic artist, teacher, and a gardener and a sculptor. Let's go to the next slide. I am going to be focusing on, for this presentation, his mason jar work, so I'll kind of keep coming back to that. I'll talk about why a bit later. So I want to start with a quick biography for anybody who doesn't know who Victor Cicansky is. Cicansky is kind of a heavy hitter in terms of Regina and Saskatchewan as well. He was born in 1935 here in Regina. He's still alive. He's still making work as well. He's like 84. He was a founding member of the Regina Clay movement, which was a pretty big kind of regionalist, material-based movement that happened in southern Saskatchewan, based in Regina, but that involved like Joe Fafard and other famous Saskatchewan artists. He was given an honorary PhD in visual arts by the University of Regina in 2007, I believe. He was a professor emeritus, and he's a holder of some major awards, which I won't use time to read. But he's also, he's very widely collected in Saskatchewan. He has works in every major Saskatchewan gallery in terms of representation and permanent collections. He's very prolific in that way. And he's also one of the most widely collected among just like collectors, as well as galleries. So he's got a pretty extensive influence in this province. And this is a cute picture of him in his studio. So, but to talk about his actual methods, he's primarily known for ceramics, but he also does quite a bit of bronze casting work. So mold making and molding is a part of both of those processes, which is kind of a sculpture and repetition practice. Patina, painting. So different methods of creating color on sculpted surfaces. Firing and glazing are specific to ceramics. I haven't done any since I was an adolescent, but for anybody who's never done it, firing is just a ceramics process. And then in terms of his research, I've included gardening, food preparation, storytelling, and materials testing. So, in terms of defining those methods, bronze casting is a method of making a sculpture, often out of clay, although he also uses wood and wax, and not just clay and wax. And then a mold is created, and then that's filled with molten bronze. And I have a diagram that I'll show, and I'll explain it a little bit more extensively. But patina is when chemicals are painted onto the metal, and then they're fired using a blowtorch usually, which creates a certain color on the surface of the metal. And a foundry is the place where they actually pour the bronze. So Victor doesn't do that himself. It's done in a foundry, which is like a workshop of people who pour molten metal. And the foundry he uses actually was established by Joe Fafard for making his works. So plaster casting is a ceramic specific version. of that. So a plaster mold is created around an art piece, and then it's filled with this water-based or watery consistency of clay called slip or slurry. And then the plaster kind of sucks some of the water out, and I'll go into that more with the diagram as well. Firing is just the technical term for when clay pieces are put in a special oven, which is called a kiln, which bakes the clay at a high temperature, dependent on the type of clay, which fixes it, and the glaze as well. And glaze is a material that usually comes in a liquid that's applied to the surface of the ceramic materials, which gives it a waterproof seal, and can also be used to give color as well. Glazes are a mix of minerals and chemicals, usually some glass, which then has to be fired in order to kind of melt and adhere to the clay. So for the diagrams, because it's really hard to explain how these processes work without a visual representation. The first one is the slip casting. So an original sculpture would be made and then placed in a 2-piece liquid plaster mold. So usually, plaster would be poured and then the piece put in, and then some kind of shim or barrier so that it can be pulled apart and more plaster poured on top. And then the two halves come apart, and you have an impression of the original work, is then, the mold is then put together without the work in it, and this liquid clay is poured into it. And then plaster is very thirsty material, it pulls water out. So it then draws the water out of the clay, and what you get is almost like the way ice cubes freeze, if you've ever waited for ice cubes to freeze, where all around the edges and the top it solidifies, but then the middle is still liquid. So that's what happens, is this liquidy clay called slip. It dries around in the kind of most immediate inside of the mold, but then the center of it is still liquid. So once that's happened and that outer shell is dry, they pour the liquid out of it, and you have this hollow exact copy of the original clay piece. So that's slip casting. Bronze is it works on the same principle, but it's just slightly more complex. So it starts with a core material, so something that will fill the empty space, and then the actual detailed model is created in wax. So in Victor's case, he uses wood as the core, and then he sculpts in wax over top of it. But it's also very common for that center to be clay. And then kind of sticks are added to it that will serve as tubes to pour the metal into. And then that whole thing is encased in layers and layers of ceramic, but a ceramic that can withstand very high temperatures. And then the whole thing is baked. So the core remains inside, but the wax all melts and burns out. So you have this empty shell where the wax was. And it also cures that ceramic material, which is the mold. And then the molten bronze is poured into the mold and takes the shape that the wax would have left. And then they kind of chip away all the material and cut off the kind of tubes that are left there, and then sand it all down, and then you can add patina to it. So in terms of Victor's research concerns, a lot of it has to do with regionalism, local history. He talks a lot about his childhood in Regina, which he was Romanian born, and Regina in the 1930s was very anti-European in that sense. Eastern European, that's the word I'm looking for. So he grew up in a neighborhood that had no municipal support, so it didn't have any infrastructure for running water or electricity, specifically because the kind of Eastern European labor class was all kind of pushed into that neighborhood. So it's kind of an interesting part of Regina's history that he's interested in. He also talks a lot about environmentalism. And he's been a teacher most of his career. So he taught high school art, he taught college. And he was given a professor emeritus through the university as well. And then a lot of his research is material understanding, material testing, reading some of the books that I did. He talks extensively about, testing glazes and testing clays and testing certain techniques. And, that's something that is forever ongoing. It's not like you do it once and then it's fine. Victor, talking about his own processes, he says, I just learned it by doing it. He just does things and then he figures it out. So that's a big part of the materials testing. And he also talks about how he works from his experience. So a big part of his kind of research is really based in this recounting of personal experiences and like his family and storytelling that happened in his family as well. So specifically talking about the preserve works, which is what he calls them, but the mason jars with the gold lids, they're made from molds. So he makes one master version and then he makes the mold of it and he repeats them. So that was one reason why I chose them, because I feel like that has some tie-in with my work in terms of repetition. They're also kind of singular works, so every once in a while he'll make a big pantry and he'll put them all in there, but they also stand alone as objects. And so I found there's some similarity in my work, how I always have kind of the one thing. It's based on his personal history, so in terms of, canning and jarring, he's talking about what he did as a kid and what he does now, which is very similar to what I'm doing. He also paints the color on in layers, so he'll start, he'll kind of layer up color the same way that I do when I'm printing. And his work has also been described as three-dimensional still life. And still life is primarily what I'm working in as well. So for those reasons, I felt like these works kind of dovetailed nicely with my own work. And I have this quote here from him from his book, which applies to my life as well. So I'm not going to read these all out loud because we don't have time, but I will talk very vaguely about why I included them. So I have these defining reviews. The first one is from his graduating show when he was a college student in California. And it kind of establishes pretty early on that he was admired for his just kind of technical virtuosity, his ability to make, and kind of his ability to push his material as far as possible. And then the second review is funny to me. It's a negative review. It comes from a letter. And it's just kind of this inappropriate reading of his work, where she was the acquisitions curator for the National Gallery of Canada, who Cicansky was writing to complain or point out, helpfully, whatever, that there were no prairie artists in the National Gallery's permanent collection. And they were collecting primarily from, the major centers, but nothing from kind of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta. And she said his work was bucolic, which is like quaint country stuff. And also inappropriately labeled him as representing rurality, which he actually has never lived on a farm. He's always lived in the city, and his garden has always been in the city, so it wasn't even accurate. But I've actually heard him bring up this specific correspondence multiple times, including in his panel discussion when he had his retrospective at the gallery, so it was obviously really important to him. And so, although I feel like reviews are often used to show how people are well respected or well received, I thought it was really interesting that this, even though it's not a review, but this reading of his work has been really motivating to him, this negative reading. And then the other two are both around his recent retrospective at the Mackenzie. So I chose the one from Timothy Long, who is the head curator of that show, or the co-curator, sorry, that he makes the connection to kind of environmental concerns. And then I chose this quote from Sandy Moore from a Border Crossings magazine that was an article reviewing the show. And I chose it mainly because she brings up kind of the pedagogical motivations of the show and of Victor's. And she also makes a connection to politics, which is something that not a lot of people talk about openly or regularly with his work. So for critique, going through his work, and I've been familiar with his work for a long time, and I also grew up in Regina, so his work was kind of ever present, and I remember as a kid actually being sick of seeing it because the public libraries in Regina also maintain a permanent art collection. He has a lot of works collected by the library as well. But my critiques of his work would be primarily that his political leanings aren't very obvious. And I think the danger is when people become well-established and popular, that their kind of motivations can become hidden. Or it's almost like a really popular band where you kind of you might want to go on tour for your new album, but everybody just wants to hear the greatest hits. And I feel like artists can kind of fall into that too. So, and I think especially with the Jar works, although he is always producing new ones, he's also repeating the same old ones over and over again. And so there can be a loss of kind of new innovations. There's a certain fear of losing that security. But also I feel like a lot of the things that he says he's motivated by, and that the people who kind of know him well know he's motivated by, aren't super immediately apparent in his work, which is something that people also say about my work, but I'm working on it. In terms of my peer feedback, my peers that I was reviewed by were Brett and Cece, and I did make a couple changes based on their feedback, which was that Cece recommended I add a bio page because I didn't actually have just an introduction of who he was. Luxury of being from Saskatchewan and feeling like everybody knows who Victor Cicansky is. Sorry. So yeah, I added the bio page, and then the other suggestion was adding diagrams for the two processes of casting, because it's really hard to describe how that works without some kind of image. So that was a helpful thing. I did also, because I'm not going to get a chance to talk about my artistic response at all. This is a picture of my child in my garden, by the way. I wanted to spend a couple of seconds just talking about that. So sorry if I'm kind of going over time to do so, but one of my sources was Victor's memoir that he just published. And when I was reading it, I found this section. This is the book, by the way. On page 29. So he's talking about pickles. And he says, I loved fermented pickles best, and I even helped with the pickling. First, we'd stuff a handful of fresh dill with flower heads into half-gallon jars, and next came the cucumbers, fresh pieces of horseradish along with the leaves, 4 or 5 cloves of garlic, bay leaves, small red hot pepper, and several whole black peppercorns. Benica would sprinkle a 1/4 cup of pickling salt into the jar and then fill it with water, leaving enough room at the top for the fermentation to work. The jars were covered with cloth and allowed to sit on the kitchen table for 3 or 4 days or longer. Eating a half-sour garlic pickle and drinking some of the juice is one of my favorite canning memories. So when I read that, I was looking for stuff about the can, like the preserves works. But when I read that, I kind of realized that I had done the exact same thing this summer. So, and part of my process is that not only do I grow things and pick them and cook them, but I also exhaustively document all of those things. So, in the dead of winter and in the fall when I don't have access to that produce anymore, or when it's all frozen and whatever, I can go back through the literally thousands of pictures that I took all summer, which my family mocks me for relentlessly, but I can go back through those images at the drop of a hat and find anything that I need. So in this case, when I heard that description, I was like, oh, I fermented cucumbers over the summer on my kitchen counter with horseradish and dill flower heads and garlic and peppercorns and all of this stuff. So it was like the exact same process. And it was a fermentation. There's no vinegar added. So it actually actively ferments and creates its own vinegar from the present microorganisms that are on the cucumbers already. So I did that same process for the first time this summer, which very coincidentally I found was the exact same process he was talking about and going through. So when I read that, I decided that my artistic response would be an image of my pickles that I made this summer. So I have a different picture of them here, which is earlier on when they were greener. But I made the print, so similar to the kind of reproduction molding process that he was going through, I did with a silkscreen. And then mine was my version of the pickles, so that's why I did that. But thank you for sticking with me. I'm sorry that I'm going over time. And hopefully we'll keep talking to you guys soon. Be well. Try to take care of yourselves. My biggest challenge has just been staying sane with my toddler. So the best of luck to all of you, children or no. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you all soon. Catch you on the flip side.